The Wyoming wind carried nothing but dust, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk as Samuel Sam Hartwell guided his weathered Ford pickup down the gravel road toward his ranch. The October sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rolling hills that had been his family's legacy for 3 generations. At 62, Sam had grown accustomed to the silence. It had become his companion, his shield, and perhaps his prison. The ranch house appeared through the amber evening light, its white paint peeling like old scabs, the wraparound porch sagging under the weight of years and neglect. Sam parked beside the barn where his grandfather had once taught him to shoe horses, back when the Hartwell Ranch bustled with activity and purpose. Now most of the pastures lay empty, the cattle sold off piece by piece to pay mounting debts and medical bills that had consumed his savings like wildfire. As he stepped out of the truck, his arthritic joints protested the movement. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No lowing of cattle, no neighing of horses, no voices calling across the yard. Just the endless Wyoming wind and the creak of the old windmill that needed repair he couldn't afford. Sam walked slowly toward the house, his boots crunching on the gravel path his wife Eleanor had lined with river stones 23 years ago. She'd planted wildflowers along the borders, creating a riot of color each spring that made their modest home feel like a palace. The flowers were gone now, choked by weeds and his own inability to tend them properly since her passing 18 months ago. Inside, the house echoed with emptiness. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece. Eleanor in her wedding dress, their daughter Katie at high school graduation, their son Michael in his army uniform before his deployment to Afghanistan. Michael had been coming home for Christmas when the drunk driver ran the red light in Cheyenne. Katie lived in California now, had her own family, her own life that rarely included phone calls to her grieving father. Sam heated a can of soup on the stove and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the vast expanse of land that felt more like a burden than a blessing these days. The bank notices lay unopened on the kitchen table. He knew what they said. Foreclosure proceedings would begin soon if he couldn't make the overdue payments. The ranch that had sustained 3 generations of Hartwells would die with him. After dinner, he walked out to the front porch and settled into the old wooden rocking chair that had been his father's. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, brilliant pinpricks of light unmarred by city pollution. Out here, 40 miles from the nearest town of Millbrook, the night sky still looked the way it had when his great-grandfather first claimed this land in 1892. It was then, in the gathering darkness, that Sam began to whistle. The melody came unbidden, flowing from somewhere deep in his memory. It was a tune his grandfather had hummed while working in the barn, something his father had whistled while mending fences, a song that seemed to belong to the land itself. Sam didn't know its name or origin. It was simply part of the Hartwell legacy, passed down through generations like the deed to the ranch. The notes drifted across the empty pastures, carried by the wind toward the distant hills. For the first time in months, Sam felt a measure of peace. The melody seemed to fill the silence, transforming the loneliness into something bearable, almost beautiful. He whistled for nearly an hour, the simple tune repeating with variations, each repetition revealing new nuances. When he finally stopped, the silence that followed felt different, not empty but full of possibility. Sam went to bed that night with the melody still echoing in his mind. He slept better than he had in weeks, dreaming of summers when the ranch was alive with activity, when Eleanor hummed in the kitchen, when his children's laughter rang across the yard. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting the grass silver. Sam went about his usual routine, feeding the handful of chickens Eleanor had insisted on keeping, checking the water pump, walking the fence line near the road. It was during this walk that he noticed the first visitor. A red sedan had pulled over near his front gate, and an elderly woman sat in the driver's seat with her window down. She was humming the exact melody he had whistled the night before. Sam approached cautiously. The woman looked up and smiled, her weathered face creasing with warmth. "Morning," she said. "I'm Martha Dennison. I live about 5 miles up the road. I hope you don't mind my stopping, but I heard the most beautiful tune last night carried on the wind. It reminded me of something my grandmother used to sing when I was little. I just had to come see if I could hear it again." Sam stared at her, speechless. He'd assumed his whistling had been swallowed by the vast emptiness of the prairie. "I know it sounds strange," Martha continued, "but that melody, it felt like coming home, like remembering something I'd forgotten I'd lost." For a moment, Sam struggled to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his words came out rough with disuse and emotion. "It's an old family tune," he said quietly. "My grandfather used to whistle it." Martha's eyes brightened. Would you mind whistling it again? Just once." Sam looked around at the empty pastures, the failing ranch, the life that had shrunk to nothing but solitude and sorrow. Then he pursed his lips and began to whistle the familiar melody. The tune rose into the morning air, clear and sweet, carrying across the hills just as it had the night before. Martha's face transformed as she listened, years seeming to fall away as the melody worked its quiet magic. When the last note faded, she sat in silence for a moment, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That was exactly what my heart needed to hear." As she drove away, Sam stood by his fence watching the dust settle behind her car. For the first time in 18 months, he had shared something meaningful with another human being. The melody that had been his family's private treasure had somehow reached across the emptiness and touched another soul. That evening, he returned to the porch and whistled again, sending the ancient tune into the gathering darkness, wondering if anyone else might be listening. Says to you what, 3 days passed before Sam saw Martha again, but this time she wasn't alone. As he finished his morning chores, he noticed 2 vehicles parked by his gate, Martha's red sedan and an unfamiliar blue pickup truck. 2 people stood talking animatedly by the fence, their voices carrying across the crisp November air. Sam walked toward them, his curiosity overriding his natural inclination to avoid human contact. As he approached, he recognized the second visitor as Tom Rodriguez, a man about his own age who ran a small auto repair shop in Millbrook. Tom's weathered hands gripped the fence rails as he spoke with Martha, his voice animated with excitement. "Sam!" Martha called out when she spotted him. "I hope you don't mind us coming by again. I told Tom about the melody you whistled, and he says his family knows it too." Tom turned to face Sam, his expression mixing hope with uncertainty. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't want to intrude, but when Martha described that tune, my grandmother used to sing it to me when I was sick. She called it La Canción del Viento, the Song of the Wind. Said it came from the old country, but her family had been in Colorado for generations before settling here." Sam studied Tom's earnest face, seeing the same longing he'd witnessed in Martha's eyes. "Your grandmother sang it?" "Every night when she tucked me in," Tom replied. "She said it was a song that belonged to the land, that it would find its way to anyone who needed to hear it. I haven't thought about it in years, but when Martha hummed it for me yesterday..." He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. The 3 stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own memories. Finally, Martha spoke up. "Would you whistle it again, Sam? I brought my grandson's phone to record it. I'd like to share it with my daughter in Denver. She's been having such a hard time since her divorce." Sam hesitated. The melody had always been private, a family treasure shared only within the walls of the Hartwell home. But seeing the hope in these strangers' faces, he realized that some gifts were meant to be shared, not hoarded. He began to whistle, the familiar notes flowing easily from his lips. The tune seemed to take on new dimensions with an audience, each phrase resonating with deeper meaning. Tom closed his eyes, his lips moving silently as he remembered his grandmother's voice. Martha held up her phone, capturing not just the melody, but the moment itself. When the last note faded, Tom wiped his eyes unabashedly. "That's it," he whispered. "That's exactly how she used to sing it. There's something special about this tune," Martha added thoughtfully. "It's like it carries memories, connects us to something bigger than ourselves." As they prepared to leave, Tom turned back to Sam. "Would you mind if I told a few other folks about this? There's an old-timer at the coffee shop, Henry Walsh, who's always talking about songs his father used to know. And Maria Santos at the grocery store. She mentioned once that her great-grandmother had a lullaby that sounded similar." Sam nodded slowly. "If they want to hear it, they're welcome to come by." That evening, Sam found himself looking forward to his nightly ritual on the porch. As he settled into his rocking chair, he noticed lights in the distance, house lights from neighbors he rarely thought about, people living their own quiet lives across the vast Wyoming landscape. He began to whistle, and as the melody carried across the hills, he imagined it reaching those distant windows, perhaps stirring memories in other hearts. The thought warmed him more than his heavy jacket against the November chill. The next morning brought an unexpected sight. A small group had gathered by his fence. Along with Martha and Tom, Sam counted 4 other people: an elderly man leaning on a walking stick, a middle-aged Hispanic woman, a young couple, and someone else partially hidden behind the others. Sam approached the group with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. The elderly man stepped forward, extending a gnarled hand. "Henry Walsh," he introduced himself. "Tom told me about the tune you've been whistling. My father used to hum something mighty similar when he worked the fields, called it his thinking song, said it helped him solve problems, made the work go easier." The Hispanic woman, who Sam assumed was Maria Santos, nodded enthusiastically. "My great-grandmother, she knew this song too. She said it was older than memory, that it traveled from heart to heart like the wind travels from hill to hill." The young woman in the couple spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Jenny Morrison and this is my husband Dave. We just moved here from back east, bought the old Peterson place. We've been feeling pretty isolated, to be honest, but when we heard that melody last night," she glanced at her husband, who nodded encouragingly, "it made us feel like maybe we could belong here after all." Sam looked at each face in turn, seeing his own loneliness reflected and somehow transformed in their expressions. These were his neighbors, people he'd lived near for years without really knowing, all carrying their own burdens, their own memories, their own need for connection. "Would you whistle it for us?" Henry asked gently. "Just once more?" Sam positioned himself at the fence, his neighbors gathered around like children waiting for a story. He began the melody again, but this time something extraordinary happened. As he whistled, Henry began to hum along in a rich baritone. Maria added her voice, singing wordless notes that harmonized perfectly. Tom joined in with his own humming, and gradually, even Jenny and Dave found their way into the song. The melody that had once been Sam's solitary comfort became something larger, more beautiful than he could have imagined. 6 voices blending together, creating harmonies that seemed to rise from the earth itself and soar toward the vast Wyoming sky. When they finished, no one spoke for a long moment. The silence was different now, not empty or lonely, but full of shared wonder. "We should do this again," Martha said finally. "Maybe tomorrow evening?" Sam nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Same time tomorrow." As his neighbors dispersed, returning to their own lives and responsibilities, Sam remained by the fence. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt part of something larger than his own grief. The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass and carrying the echo of their voices across the hills. Word traveled fast in small communities, and by the end of the week, Sam's evening gatherings had grown beyond anything he could have anticipated. What started as a handful of neighbors had swelled to nearly 20 people who arrived each evening just before sunset, carrying folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and voices eager to join the mysterious melody that seemed to belong to everyone and no one. Sam watched from his kitchen window as cars and trucks lined the dirt road leading to his property. There was Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, bringing his wife and teenage daughter. The Nakamura family, who ran the local feed store, arrived with their elderly grandfather who spoke little English but hummed along with a knowing smile. Even some folks from town had started making the 40-mile drive, drawn by stories of the nightly singing that was becoming local legend. The attention made Sam uncomfortable. He'd spent 18 months cultivating solitude, and now his private refuge was being transformed into something public. As he walked toward the gathering crowd, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight with anxiety. "Sam," called out a voice he didn't recognize. A woman in her 40s approached him, notebook in hand and a professional smile plastered across her face. "I'm Rebecca Collins from the Millbrook Gazette. I'd love to do a story about what's happening here. This kind of grassroots community building is exactly what our readers want to hear about." Sam's stomach dropped. The last thing he wanted was publicity, reporters, the kind of attention that would turn his simple evening ritual into a spectacle. "I don't think that's necessary," he said quietly, but Rebecca was already pulling out her phone. "Just a few questions. How long have you been organizing these gatherings? What inspired you to start bringing the community together through music?" "I'm not organizing anything," Sam replied, backing away from the reporter. "People just started showing up." But Rebecca wasn't listening. She was already interviewing Martha, who was enthusiastically describing how the melody had touched her heart. Other people crowded around, eager to share their own stories with someone who might put their names in the paper. Sam retreated to his porch, overwhelmed by the chaos that his simple act of whistling had unleashed. This wasn't what he'd wanted. He'd just been a lonely man sharing an old family tune, not trying to start some kind of movement or event. As the crowd grew larger and more animated, Sam noticed tensions beginning to surface. The Hendersons, a family from the next county over, had brought a guitar and were trying to turn the gathering into what they called a proper sing-along. Pastor Williams was suggesting they open each session with a prayer, while Maria Santos argued that the melody was spiritual enough on its own without adding religious elements. "Maybe we should set up some kind of schedule," suggested Tom Rodriguez. "Different people could lead different songs, make it more organized." "No," said Henry Walsh firmly. "That's not what this is about. This song doesn't belong to any of us. We can't just change it to suit ourselves." The argument that followed was polite, but heated, with various factions forming around different visions of what the gathering should become. Some wanted to add instruments, others insisted on keeping it purely vocal. Some suggested moving to the community center in town, while others argued that the ranch setting was essential to the experience. Sam watched it all with growing dismay. In trying to share something beautiful, he'd inadvertently created conflict. The simple melody that had brought him peace was now becoming a source of division among his neighbors. As the sun began to set and people prepared for the evening's singing, Sam made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood up from his rocking chair and walked to the fence, but instead of beginning to whistle, he raised his hand for silence. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "I think maybe we need to take a step back here." The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to him. Sam felt his heart racing, but he pushed forward. This melody. It wasn't meant to be organized or scheduled or turned into something it's not. It's just an old song that my family's been whistling for generations. It found its way to you because you needed to hear it, just like I needed to share it. He paused, looking at the faces gathered around his fence. Some familiar neighbors, some strangers, all united by their connection to the simple tune. But if we start arguing about how to do it right, if we make it complicated or political or religious, we're going to lose the thing that brought us together in the first place. Rebecca Collins raised her notebook. "So, what are you proposing? How do you see this community tradition evolving?" Sam shook his head. "I'm not proposing anything, that's the point. This isn't about me or my ideas. It's about something bigger than any of us." He turned to look at the hills where the melody had first carried on the wind. "If you want to come here in the evenings and share this song, you're welcome. But if you want to turn it into something else, maybe you should do that somewhere else." The crowd fell silent, some people looking uncomfortable, others nodding in understanding. Pastor Williams stepped forward. "Sam's right," he said quietly. "We've been trying to organize something that can't be organized. Some things just need to be allowed to exist as they are." Jenny Morrison, the young woman who'd moved from back east, spoke up. "We came here because we heard something beautiful. Maybe we should just focus on keeping it beautiful." As if by unspoken agreement, the crowd began to settle into a rough circle around Sam's fence. The reporter put away her notebook with obvious disappointment and headed back to her car. The people with guitars and other instruments quietly set them aside. Henry Walsh looked at Sam and nodded. "Just the song then." Sam nodded back and began to whistle. This time, the melody rose pure and unadorned into the Wyoming evening, carrying with it not the weight of expectations or organization, but the simple power of shared human connection. One by one, voices joined in, not trying to improve or change the song, but simply adding their own notes to the ancient harmony that seemed to belong to the land itself. A winter arrived early that year, blanketing the Wyoming hills in pristine snow that muffled sound and transformed the landscape into something ethereal. The evening gatherings continued despite the cold, though the crowd had naturally winnowed down to the core group of neighbors who understood what they'd found together. They brought blankets and hand warmers, thermoses of hot chocolate and coffee, creating a warm circle of human connection against the vast, star-filled darkness. Sam had grown comfortable with the rhythm of these gatherings. Each evening he would emerge from his house to find familiar faces waiting by the fence. Martha with her knitted cap pulled low, Tom stamping his feet to keep warm, Henry Walsh wrapped in the wool coat he'd worn for 30 years. The Nakamura grandfather had taken to arriving early, sitting in quiet meditation until the others joined him. What surprised Sam most was how the song itself had evolved, not through conscious change but through the natural process of many voices finding harmony together. Each person brought their own family's version, slight variations in rhythm, different ways of breathing between phrases, personal inflections that had been passed down through generations. Rather than creating discord, these differences wove together into something richer and more complex than the simple melody Sam had whistled alone. It was on a particularly cold December evening that everything changed again. Sam was preparing to begin the evening song when he noticed an unfamiliar figure standing apart from the usual group. A young woman in her 30s, wearing a military surplus jacket and standing with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to be ready for anything. Something about her silhouette stirred a memory so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. "Katie," he whispered, then louder, "Katie." His daughter turned toward his voice, her face emerging from the shadows. The years since he'd last seen her had added lines around her eyes and silver threads to her dark hair, but her smile was exactly as he remembered. "Hi, Dad," she said simply. The gathered neighbors fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. Sam walked slowly toward the fence, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. When did you get here?" "This afternoon. I drove straight through from California." Katie gestured toward the small group of people waiting respectfully nearby. "Jenny Morrison called me, said there was something happening here I needed to see." Sam glanced at Jenny, who offered a small, encouraging smile. He turned back to his daughter, struggling to find words for the emotions flooding through him. "I heard about the singing," Katie continued, "about how you've been bringing people together with Grandpa's old song. It sounded so much like the dad I remembered, the one who used to whistle while he worked, who made everything seem possible." "I thought you'd forgotten about this place," Sam said quietly. "About me?" Katie's eyes filled with tears. "I never forgot. I just didn't know how to come back after everything that happened. After Mom died, after Michael, I was angry at this place, at the life that took them both from us. But hearing about what you've been doing here," she paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, "it reminded me that this land isn't just about loss. It's about the good things too, the memories that matter." Henry Walsh stepped forward gently. "Maybe tonight we should let family have their reunion." "No," Katie said quickly. "Please don't leave on my account. I'd like to hear the song, if that's okay. Mom used to hum it sometimes when she thought no one was listening." Sam felt his throat tighten at the mention of Eleanor. He nodded to Henry, then looked around at the circle of neighbors who had become something like family over these past months. "Tonight feels different," he said. "Tonight feels like the song wants to be shared one more time, but maybe in a new way." He began to whistle, but for the first time in months he wasn't standing alone by the fence. Katie moved to stand beside him, and after a moment she began to hum along. Not the melody he was whistling, but a harmony that Eleanor used to add when she thought the men weren't paying attention. The effect was magical. The familiar song suddenly revealed hidden depths, spaces for other voices that no one had noticed before. Tom joined in with a bass line his grandmother had taught him. Maria added a descant that soared above the main melody. Even the Nakamura grandfather contributed a rhythmic humming that seemed to anchor all the other voices. But it was when Henry Walsh began to speak, sing the lyrics his father had attached to the melody, words about resilience and hope and the eternal rhythm of seasons, that Sam realized they weren't just singing a song anymore. They were creating something entirely new while honoring something ancient. The music continued for longer than usual that night, as if no one wanted to break the spell. When it finally ended, the silence was profound, filled with the weight of connection and understanding. As the neighbors began to gather their things and head home, each one stopped to greet Katie, welcoming her back not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged to this extended family they'd accidentally created. When they were finally alone, father and daughter stood together by the fence, looking out over the snow-covered hills where the melody had first carried on the wind. "Will you stay for Christmas?" Sam asked. "I was hoping you'd let me stay longer than that," Katie replied. "The ranch needs work, and I could use a place to figure out what comes next in my life." Sam felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the thermos of hot coffee in his hands. "Your room's exactly like you left it." They walked toward the house together, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Behind them, the fence stood empty but not forgotten, a gathering place that had transformed a dying ranch into the heart of a community. That night, for the first time since Eleanor's death, Sam went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would bring not just another day of survival, but another chance to share something beautiful with the people who mattered most. The ancient melody had worked its quiet magic, healing more than just loneliness. It had restored hope, rebuilt connection, and reminded everyone who heard it that no one has to face life's challenges alone. In the distance, carried on the winter wind, the faint echo of the evening's song still seemed to linger among the hills, waiting to be discovered by the next person who needed to remember that they belonged somewhere, to someone, to something larger than themselves.